fantasy writers that this country's produced.
Perfect. So I can just sit here and wait till it's done.
Notable are
Yeah.
Ethan
Great.
Both,
There you go.
who,
All right. Thanks very much.
Enjoy. For 3 years, I believe, and worked as a D&D employee, and wrote some of his most memorable fiction here, including novels like Slan, The Weapon Shops of Isher, Book of Patath. In addition to that, there was Archibald Lampman, who again was a civil servant, and he wrote what is regarded as one of the finest science fiction poems of the 19th century, The City at the End of Things, while living in Ottawa. And certainly at present, during the course of the past few years, Ottawa has emerged as the fantasy capital of Canada, with the presence of Galad Elflandsson and Charles Saunders, and Gordon Derry.
So in John Bell's words, Ottawa is the capital of fantasy writing in this country, which sounded to me like one of the best-kept secrets in the world. I mean, how come I'd never heard of any of these people until I started working on this series?
Over the course of the last 100 years or so, Canada has produced in the neighborhood of 250 science fiction and fantasy writers. But most of their fiction is long forgotten. I think the problem in this country is that we tend to overlook or neglect our popular culture. So it's not that Canadian imaginative literature doesn't exist. It's just that, on the whole, we're unfamiliar with it, and we've forgotten it. Right now, the lines of communication in this country run north-south. All of the various fan groups across Canada are plugged into their American counterparts. And they're all very conscious of what's being done in the United States, and are totally disregarding indigenous Canadian science fiction and fantasy. So I think that it's very important that we encourage Canadian fans to start looking at our own Canadian product, and it's been and our contribution has been a very substantial one. I think that when that happens, it can only serve to promote Canadian science fiction and fantasy and Canadian popular culture in general. And I think that it'll make it a lot easier for Canadian writers to publish in this country. It won't be necessary for them, as it is now, to flog their manuscripts in either Britain or the United States. What will eventually happen is that our Van Beaus won't have to leave Ottawa. They can stay here. Hal Foster, for instance, the creator of Prince Valiant, was from Nova Scotia. But there's just no way. The choice he had to make was to survive in Canada as an illustrator for Eaton's catalogs and Hudson's Bay catalogs, or move to the United States where he could draw comic strips like Tarzan and Prince Valiant. I think that once that Canadians see that it's important that our nationalism should express itself in popular culture, that our creative artists won't have to go into exile, they can stay here. And that I think that each nation derives an enormous amount of its own identity from its popular culture. I think that serious literature is obviously very important, and institutions like the Canada Council feel obliged to fund it. But I think that they're making a serious mistake when they ignore our popular artists. In fact, in effect, what they're doing is driving them out of the country. And that can only destroy Canadian culture. I think that a nation wins or loses its independence on its newsstands.
That was John Bell, the editor of Borealis, which is a Canadian fantasy magazine.
Ken, we have a few seconds here. Can you tell us about some of the other interviews coming up in the series?
Sure, Fraser. The next week, next Monday at this time, we'll be hearing a conversation I had with Galad Elflandsson, who is an Ottawa fantasy writer with a whole lot of short stories to his credit. His first novel, The Black Wolf, has just come out in paperback here, and these days he's in the middle of writing the second one. That's next week.
Okay, we'll look forward to that. Remember, you can live out someone else's fantasy with Ken Ross and me, Mondays at this time. Over the next few weeks, you're on All in a Day.
Yes, today's interview is with the writer of fantasy and horror. Now, this man has published numerous book reviews, short stories, and to date, one novel called The Black Wolf, which has just come out in paperback. His name isn't easy to forget, at least not once you've learned it. He calls himself Galad Elflandsson. He doesn't talk a lot about his name, but he's more than willing to discuss his work. And I started out by asking him why he liked to write.
The appeal of writing is that it's limitless. You can do whatever you want. You can get across any points you want in any form that you'd like to. And you can be as effective or as ineffective as you choose to be. Writing doesn't... There's no limits on, whatever you have to say, there's some way you can say it. And whatever you want to live at any particular time, you can live it in what you're writing. And the images are all there.
Is Ottawa a good town for writers, do you think?
I find it so. It's not too big and it's not too small. And it's a nice place to be. There's enough of a country and enough of a city to give you insights into whatever background you'd like to use. If you want a country setting, you can walk into a park any day. And if you want to, get yourself down into a city wasteland type thing, walk down any street in downtown Ottawa. And the aura, so to speak, is conducive to people sitting down and putting their thoughts or their ideas or images on paper.
Is reading a really important part of your writing?
It's the most important part. You can't write unless you read, and read all the time, any genre of literature whatsoever, because it all contributes. There's no such thing as complete originality anymore. It's very difficult to find it. People tap different sources, and they come up with a different combination, which makes them quote-unquote unique for the time that they're writing in. But there's nothing original anymore. You have to read, because you have to have sources beyond just experience. You have to have the style to be able to make it effective. And that style is synthesized out of every other style that was ever used by anybody else.
Every writer seems to have a certain background that they work from, a certain mythology that they work from. Is there any kind of mythology that you could say underlies the work that you do?
Definitely Scandinavian mythology, because I'm sort of a fatalist. Not in that fate, as it were, is totally inexorable. It's just more the attitude, knowing that there's a fabric of life that 9.9 out of every 10 people is going to fit into, and that leaves them various choices, but it still remains within the fabric of life that's already been chosen for them.
Fantasy, science fiction, and horror are types of writing that, face it, have a real credibility problem. Which makes sense in a way. Why should they be taken seriously? I mean, after all, isn't fantasy just a cheap escape?
I don't acknowledge that at all. I don't think fantasy and escape... the escape is derogatory, and when it's applied to fantasy, it becomes totally meaningless, because I have read almost nothing but fantasy for the past 6 or 7 years, and I can say without any reservation that whatever you're looking for, whether it's social comment, psychology, it can all be found in fantasy. And there's, any fiction of any kind is escape. So I don't know why it should be fantasy should be branded as being escape. They're the same token science fiction. The history of fantasy is such that I believe it has just as much to offer as any other genre of literature that's ever been followed by any other writer.
And that was Galad Elflandsson.
Series continues next Monday. Ken, who are you going to be talking to then?
Well, next week, Fraser, we're going to hear from a writer concerned with chronicling Black African mythology. His name is Charles Saunders. His work has appeared in Da and Zebra paperback anthologies. He's fairly well known, a very good writer. Should be fun.
Sounds like fascinating stuff. I'm looking forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Ken Ross.
They hope. That's right, Fraser, exactly. Today I have a conversation with Charles R. Saunders. Now, Saunders has lived in Ottawa for most of the past decade. His work has appeared in small press magazines throughout North America, and for a time he helped run an Ottawa fantasy publishing house, Triskel Press, which is still a going concern. His work has also appeared in mass-market paperback anthologies put out by both Zebra and Da publishers in the States. And right now, he's in the middle of writing an enormous novel, which, like his short stories, address one specific subject, which is very close to his heart.
When I started writing, it was for a specific purpose, which was to counteract the distorted picture of Africa that has existed in most fantasy literature, and I'm talking primarily about Edgar Rice Burroughs' stories to a small smaller extent, Robert E. Howard, and then before them, H. Rider Haggard. Actually, Haggard wasn't all that bad for 19th century, but he was still 19th century. Anyway, the Africa that's depicted in those stories is a place that's full of savages, cannibals, subhumans, and so on. And that, to me, is a mythology for which a counter-mythology should exist. So I went to primary sources. Like some contemporary people, when they're writing about Africa, they'll simply assume that what Burroughs said was correct, and that will be their source. But I went to mythology collections, I went to African history books, and from those sources I constructed an alternate Africa. And that is the source, or that's the setting for all of my writing, this alternate Africa that I cobbled together from various history and mythology from all over the continent.
How many stories would you say you've done about it to date?
About 30.
And have they all been published?
They've all been accepted for publication. Some of them have been kind of hanging in limbo. I have appeared in magazines, but they have not been major magazines. They've been small press magazines. So there's a gap. Like I've been in small press magazines, I've been in paperback anthologies, but I have not been in Fantastic or Asimov's or anything like that.
Is that still a goal for you? Are you still sending stories to those publishers?
At this point, I'm working primarily on the novel, but after that, I'll try to see if I can break into that market as well, because it is mass circulation newsstand magazines are still a prestigious market.
When did you know that you wanted to write?
About 10 years ago was when my interest in African history and culture, my interest in fantasy, my dislike of the African fantasy that existed then, and my strange feeling that I could write all sort of came together at once. Before that, all of those things existed discreetly, but when they all came together, that's when I decided that I wanted to write African fantasy, and that's when I started.
Do you feel that this kind of literature, fantasy literature in particular, is approaching general respectability that it didn't have before?
Well, that's kind of a touchy question. I get really irked by this question of the respectability of fantasy and science fiction, because the oldest literature in the world is fantasy. The half of the things that classical scholars study are ancient fantasies, Greek fantasies, Celtic, and so on. I don't understand why there is even a question of the respectability of fantasy other than the bad name it may have received during the pulp era of the 1930s. But that particular common denominator brought down every form of literature, not just fantasy. So to be more direct, I think that fantasy is becoming more popular. I think that perhaps some of the people who were led not to respect it previously are now beginning to look at it more objectively and more informed.
What appeals to you most about the genre? Not necessarily your own writing and the mythology that you've been getting into, but what appeals to you about fantasy in general?
I think it and science fiction are the only forms of literature remaining that really give free rein to the imagination. Other fiction seems to be tied to either restrictions of the genre, like westerns and detective stories, or else they're tied to what sells, which is commercial mainstream fiction, or else they're tied to what the academics are writing their theses on, which is serious literature. Fantasy and SF is the only kind of literature that really pays little attention to those kinds of restrictions. Of course, they have some restrictions of their own, but they're not quite the same as the others. I like it for escape value. I think that fantasy is just another manifestation of man's desire to use his imagination and to imagine what's over the next hill. We don't have too many more hills left, so we have to imagine the hills along with what's over them.
And that was Charles Saunders.
Okay, Ken, we continue the series again next week about the same time. Who are you going to be talking to then?
Well, next week, Fraser, a bit of a renaissance man, I think. Gordon Derry is a musician, a woodworker, a carver, and a writer. And he's a pretty good writer, as well as carver, woodworker, and musician, so he's going to be fun to talk to.
A man of rather divergent interests. Look forward to that. Thanks very much, Ken.
Okay.
Ken Ross, brings us
House man today, Fraser. We're going to hear a conversation I had with Gordon Derry, the author of a number of fantasy short stories. He's in the middle of writing his first full-length novel right now. In addition to writing fantasy, Derry is a word worker. He wants to say woodworker, folks. A carver and a musician. In short, he's really a man of diverse interests.
My primary interest really is to, I know this sounds strange, but to try and understand life. When I was at university, when I started, I kind of gravitated towards philosophy because that was the only discipline that was really directed towards understanding basic things. And that's really what I want to do, and that's part of my writing, is exploring different facets of reality for myself more than for readers, I would say.
What kind of writer would you describe yourself as?
The only thing I can really say is I write what I feel like writing. Generally, I like to write things other than what is happening in the ordinary day-to-day existence, things outside the normal experience. I suppose that can be referred to as fantasy, but, you know, I don't really feel it's really absolutely fantasy because I think it's all drawn from my real experiences.
Is there a specific appeal that writing has for you? Does it do something that none of your other activities can do for you?
Yeah. Writing satisfies a very fundamental need for me. I feel that I have very high ideals, I suppose you'd call them. I have sort of dreams about the way things ought to be. And I came to the realization a number of years ago that in this one life I could not possibly experience all the things I want to experience. And so by writing, I can enact scenarios and situations that I know I'll never get into, and I can explore possibilities of things that will never occur to me in my life. So in this way, I guess I can enact my fantasies, and I can experience things that I realize I probably would never experience in my life. I hope that I could experience other people's feelings as well as my own.
Is Ottawa a good town to be a writer and live in?
People have asked me that before. I originally come from a place called Richmond Hill, just north of Toronto, and a lot of people from that area asked me why I live in Ottawa. My only reaction to that really is a similar sort of reaction to what Henry Miller had when he lived in Paris, and some Americans asked him why he lived there. I feel that Ottawa doesn't really offer a great amount, but in a way it offers a lot of environment in what it doesn't take away. I feel I can be my own person in Ottawa, whereas in a place like Toronto or Montreal I feel entirely lost. I wouldn't feel myself. I've also met some very talented and interesting people in Ottawa. I don't think they're the general run-of-the-mill person. I think they're exceptions, but I've met them here in Ottawa, whereas I've not been able to meet people like that in other places.
Is there a writers' community in Ottawa?
I believe there are several writers' communities. The only one that I have any first-hand experience with is the fantasy writers' community, which consists basically of 4 people: myself, Galad Elflandsson, Charles Saunders, and Charles DeWint. And I cannot speak for myself, but I feel those other 3 people are very talented, and they're all nice people. It's a sort of environment that is competitive yet non-competitive. No one is out to achieve any more than the other person, but at the same time, when you find out that one person has done something, it kind of spurs you on to kind of keep up with them. And I need that sort of thing. I have a lot of other interests that try and, well, they don't try. I guess I let them draw away my time from writing, and I need this sort of impetus to keep me writing because I really want to do it.
That was fantasy writer Gordon Derry.
And a fascinating man indeed, Ken. What's on tap for next week?
Well, next week's interview, Fraser, which incidentally is the second to last installment in this series, is with Charles DeWint. Many people around Ottawa know Charles for his involvement with the Celtic band Wickentry. And he also runs a fantasy publishing house called Triscal Press, and we'll hear a lot more about that from him.
Well, these guys have varied interests, don't they?
They certainly do. They make me feel very bad about myself.
Thanks very much, Ken. Don't feel too bad.